Hey, it's Ed here. I want to talk about the addiction epidemic, and I want to reframe this conversation. Do we have an addiction epidemic, or do we have a self-medicating epidemic? And because we see in the news that people are testifying in front of Congress because Purdue Pharmaceuticals has gotten everybody addicted to OxyContin, and that they're killing people. We want to sue them. We want to throw them in prison. And at the end of the day, those are not solutions. Those are punitive. They're punishing. And yeah, a lot of people did get addicted to OxyContin and hydrocodone. But think about this. Percocet and Darvocet have been around for years. Darvocet was around, started in circulation in 1957, and Percocet was 1970. Now, Darvocet was made with Darvon, and they've since banned it. They just banned it in 2010, so only 9 years ago. Percocet was actually made with OxyCodone. I remember taking it when I broke my arm, and they had to do surgery, and it was pretty strong. Made a lot of people nauseous. People couldn't take it. But why didn't we have a lot of more people back then who were addicted? Because think about it. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you could go to the doctor and get a prescription of 30, 40, 50, 100 Darvocet or Percocets, and they would just keep refilling it. As long as you said you were in pain, they kept handing them out. But let's even go back a little further. Let's go back to the Vietnam era GIs. While they were in Vietnam, many of them started using heroin because heroin was really cheap, it was plentiful, and it was 80% pure. And they estimate that 20% of the GIs that were in Vietnam used heroin. They actually smoked it because it was odorless, and nobody would detect it, so they would get away with it. But according to a report in 1971 by the Department of Defense, 51% of the armed forces smoked marijuana, 31% used psychedelics such as LSD, mescaline, psilocybin mushrooms, and an additional 28% took hard drugs. Now, this is from the Department of Defense. Those are their numbers. Now, there was over 8 million people, men and women deployed, mostly men deployed in Vietnam. And they estimate that their fear was hundreds of thousands of them would come back addicted to heroin. And so that 20%, that would be 1.7 million GIs coming back from Vietnam addicted. And I have to tell you, if anybody had an excuse to self-medicate, it would be the GIs coming back from Vietnam, because not only was it a horrific war, they seen some atrocities, some horrors that we can't even imagine. But when they came back, then there were protesters who greeted them and spit on them and called them baby killers. So yeah, now they have the trauma of the war, the PTSD. They didn't call it PTSD back then, but they had their own American people protesting them and spitting on them when they got off the planes coming home from the war. But what the military did do is they knew that there was a lot of drug use over there, so they would do a drug test, and if you failed the drug test, you had to stay in country, stay in Vietnam, until you detoxed enough that you could pass a UA, be clean from drugs. But they still thought that many of those would come back and relapse And they were really concerned about that Nixon, he wanted to figure out really what was happening. And so they commissioned a study, and this Lee Robbins, she took on the study, and it was believed back then that once you were addicted to heroin, you were an addict for life. But what they found was only 5% of the people coming back from the war relapsed. Those who had tested positive for drugs actually relapsed. And in the first year, within 3 years, only 12% relapsed. So compare and contrast that to what we see is the norm. Back then, they said 90% of those using heroin relapsed. So they couldn't figure out what really was going on. And we look at addiction now, and 80% plus relapse from drugs or alcohol. So they decided that they need to do an experiment. They did an experiment with rats, and they put rats by themselves in a cage, isolated, and they put regular water, they put morphine water, and cocaine water. What they found is the rats that were in the cage by themselves would gravitate towards the morphine or the cocaine water, and they would use it, drink it until they died. And so then they put rats in cages, and they called them rat parks because they had, wheels and climbing and things and everything that was entertaining to a rat. And they put regular water, morphine water, and cocaine water. And they found that those rats rarely used the drugged water, the cocaine or the morphine water. And because they were interacting, they were social, they were having rat sex. So their conclusion was even more puzzling to them. So they said, why is it that the GIs coming back to the United States didn't relapse like they expected, because they expected 90%. And then they did this experiment with the rats, and they said, well, geez, maybe our treatment methodology of, shaming and punishing isn't the best way. But they also said that GIs feared that their families would disown them, they would look down on them, they were afraid of losing their jobs, they were afraid of going to prison. And so you look at what has changed. What has changed in society? Society, as we grow up, we enable bad behavior. We don't disincentivize bad behavior. We actually, maybe in some respects, we actually incentivize it, because there's no consequences to your behavior. So looking at that, maybe we don't have an addiction problem or a drug problem or an alcohol problem. Maybe what we have is a self-medicating epidemic, because we're not giving people hope, meaning, and purpose. Look back at what's happened in our school system. Kids get away with anything. When I grew up, I remember the PE teacher, if you got in trouble, he would say, let the Board of Education meet the seat of learning. And he had a hack paddle that was about 24 inches long, and boy, let me tell you, it only happened to me once, but it only took once, and I never misbehaved in this class. So think about that for a minute. We have a society that does not disincentivize. We enable bad behavior, evident by what's happening on the streets in every city with the homeless population. We let them do whatever they want. We don't punish people for their criminal behavior. You go over to Seattle, and they don't even investigate when somebody breaks in your home and steals your TV, or they break into your car. They don't even investigate it. It's like, why bother? You know, there's guys over there that have a rap sheet that they've been arrested 60 and 70 times. If you look at the documentary Seattle is Dying, and they actually talk about that. 3 grams of heroin, they don't even arrest you for that. 3 grams of heroin, that's a lot of heroin. So we have drug dealers who are not being held accountable. We have drug addicts that are not being treated properly. Their criminal behavior is not being dealt with. So what would you expect? We have an epidemic of people self-medicating because their life has no purpose. And I always tell people we need hope, meaning, and purpose. And until people have meaning and purpose in their life, just like those rats, that's about as good a proof as you can get. And you look at the GIs, 1.7 million GIs came back and weren't addicts. That's huge. Those numbers are absolutely undeniable. So we need to shift the conversation, stop blaming. We need to create solutions. You know, when we run around and just blame, we sue people, throw people in prison. The only people that are getting, that are benefiting from this is the attorneys. Imagine how much money the attorneys for Purdue Pharmacy is making. You know, all the states have attorneys. Purdue Pharmacy probably has 50 attorneys on their payroll, and each state has, I don't know, 3-4 attorneys fighting this. So imagine the millions of dollars that is being spent to punish a drug maker that, they incentivize doctors to prescribe their medication, and their marketing practice was sketchy. But it's not benefiting anybody but the attorneys. Shift the conversation to treating the self-medicating nature, mental illness, and addiction, instead of just punitive. We have enough people in prison. We don't need to throw more people in prison. And we have enough homeless. We don't need more homeless. So let's shift the conversation to solutions.